Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. Foundations. Doug Mercer wiped sweat from his brow as he surveyed the dilapidated apartment building in front of him. At 32, he'd scraped together every penny from his construction jobs to make a down payment on this eyesore in a neglected part of Boston. His colleagues called him crazy. His father, a lifetime construction worker with arthritic hands and perpetual financial struggles, warned him against playing with the big boys. But Doug saw what others couldn't: potential. "You're either the most stubborn fool I've ever met, or you've got vision," said Walt Bennett, the grizzled real estate agent who'd reluctantly shown Doug the property after 5 other agents refused to waste their time. "Either way, I respect the hell out of it." Doug's calloused hands gripped the newly signed deed. "My old man taught me to build things that last. Figured it was time to start building something for myself." That first renovation nearly broke him, physically and financially. Doug worked his construction job by day and rehabilitated the building by night, sleeping on a cot in what would eventually become the building's maintenance room. 6 months of 16-hour days later, he had transformed the 12-unit building into affordable but respectable housing. He was leaning against his pickup truck, admiring his handiwork, when he first saw her, Natalie Cruz, a potential tenant clutching a rental application, her dark hair catching the afternoon sunlight. She worked as an administrator at Boston Memorial Hospital and had a smile that made Doug's carefully calculated investment plans suddenly seem secondary. "Is this really only $1,100 a month?" she asked skeptically, glancing between the building and the listing. "What's wrong with it?" "Nothing's wrong with it," Doug replied, standing straighter. "I just believe working people deserve decent housing they can actually afford." Their connection was immediate. Within 6 months, Natalie moved from her apartment into Doug's modest home in Dorchester. She brought warmth to his practical, austere life. Colorful throw pillows on his utilitarian furniture, spices in his nearly empty kitchen cabinets, and a perspective that complemented his own. "You work too hard," she'd tell him, massaging his shoulders as he pored over potential property investments late into the night. "But I admire your drive." Over the next 5 years, Doug's portfolio grew from 1 building to 15. He had an instinct for identifying undervalued properties and the construction knowledge to economically transform them. He wasn't flashy. He still drove his old pickup and lived in the same modest home. But his net worth had quietly grown to 8 figures. Natalie's career had advanced too. She'd moved from administration to hospital fundraising, where her natural charm and intelligence helped her excel at cultivating wealthy donors. Her social circle expanded, introducing her to Boston's elite. Initially, Doug enjoyed watching her thrive, even as he felt increasingly out of place at the high society functions she now attended. "You should let me buy you something nicer than that secondhand suit," Natalie said before a hospital gala, straightening his tie with a slight frown. "What's wrong with it?" Doug asked, genuinely puzzled. "It's clean and fits fine." "Nothing's wrong with it." She echoed his words from when they'd first met, but her tone lacked sincerity. "I just want people to see you how I see you." The comment stung more than he showed. Doug wondered when his practical nature had become something to conceal rather than a quality Natalie had once admired. At the gala, he met Blake Whitfield for the first time, handsome, polished, old money. Blake managed investments for several hospital board members and spoke with practiced ease about wines, European vacations, and prep schools. He addressed Doug with surface-level politeness, but barely concealed condescension. "Real estate. How fascinating," Blake said, swirling his whiskey. "I dabble in property myself, mostly vacation homes in Nantucket and Aspen. Nothing as hands-on as your ventures." Doug caught the way Natalie laughed a bit too appreciatively at Blake's quips, touched his arm a moment too long. He filed away the observation without commenting. When they returned home that night, Natalie seemed distant. "You barely said anything all evening," she sighed, removing her earrings. "I say something when I have something worth saying," Doug replied, loosening his tie. "Blake had plenty to say for both of us." Natalie's expression hardened slightly. "Blake Whitfield is respected in circles that could open doors for us. For you. Why can't you make more of an effort?" "I didn't realize my circles needed expanding," Doug said quietly. That night marked a subtle but distinct shift in their relationship. Doug continued building his empire with the same dedication, but Natalie's attention drifted increasingly toward the social world she'd discovered: charity boards, cultural galas, weekend retreats with her new friends. Doug noticed, but remained silent, burying himself in his work to avoid confronting what was happening. 2 years later, Doug proposed. Not with a flashy diamond that would impress Natalie's new friends, but with his grandmother's restored ring, simple, elegant, meaningful. Natalie hesitated just long enough before saying yes that Doug felt a flicker of uncertainty. But he pushed it aside. He was a builder, after all. He could fix this too. Their wedding was a compromise, larger than Doug would have preferred, but more modest than Natalie's subtle hints had suggested she wanted. He watched her throughout the reception, beautiful in her gown, laughing with her sophisticated friends, and wondered if she was truly happy or if she was already calculating what came next. "You've done well for yourself, Doug," said Walt Bennett, now retired but still one of the few people Doug considered a friend. "Just remember what you're building and why." Doug nodded, unable to articulate the growing fear that he and Natalie were constructing entirely different lives. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Structure. 3 years into their marriage, Doug and Natalie Mercer appeared successful by conventional standards. They'd moved from Doug's Dorchester home to a renovated brownstone in Back Bay, a compromise that gave Natalie the prestigious address she wanted while allowing Doug to maintain his connection to his work. Doug's real estate holdings had expanded significantly, now including commercial properties and development projects throughout Greater Boston. Natalie had left the hospital to become the executive director of the Beacon Hill Foundation, a position that placed her at the center of Boston's philanthropic community. Her days were filled with luncheons, committee meetings, and fundraising events. She dressed in designer clothing, maintained a meticulous appearance, and had mastered the social graces that Doug still found unnecessary. Doug noticed the widening gap between them, but struggled to bridge it. His attempts to connect, suggesting weekend trips to Vermont or simple dinners at their old favorite restaurants, were often met with scheduling conflicts or Natalie's gentle redirection toward events more aligned with her new social standing. "Doug, the Whitmore's benefit is this Saturday," she would say, scrolling through her perpetually full calendar. "We really should make an appearance. Gerald might be interested in your seaport development." Doug would agree, knowing that networking was practical for business, but feeling increasingly that his role had become that of Natalie's accessory, the successful but rough around the edges husband who provided financial backing for her social ascent. At these functions, Doug observed Blake Whitfield's continued presence in their lives. Blake had recently divorced his wife of 7 years and now appeared at many of the same events as Natalie, always impeccably dressed, always ready with a compliment for her or an inside joke that excluded Doug. One evening, returning home early from a business trip to find Natalie out despite having told him she planned a quiet night in, Doug found himself opening her laptop, something he'd never done before. Her password was still the same combination of her birthday and maiden name she'd always used. Her email revealed numerous messages from Blake, initially professional, but gradually shifting to a more personal tone. "Just seeing your face across the room today made a tedious meeting bearable. You bring light to these stuffy affairs." Doug closed the laptop, feeling hollow. He hadn't found definitive evidence of an affair, but the intimacy in the messages made him physically ill. That night, when Natalie returned home smelling faintly of unfamiliar cologne, he said nothing, watching her move through their bedroom with the strange detachment of someone observing a stranger. "How was your meeting?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Productive," she replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "The capital campaign is finally gaining momentum." Doug nodded, wondering when lying had become easier for her than telling the truth. He wondered, too, why he wasn't confronting her. Perhaps because naming what was happening would force action, and despite everything, he wasn't ready to dismantle what they'd built. In the following weeks, Doug found himself doing something that went against his straightforward nature. He began investigating. He hired a private investigator, a woman named Rose Flanagan, who had retired from the Boston PD after 20 years as a detective. "I don't normally take domestic cases," Rose told him bluntly in her office, a converted garage in Quincy. "They get messy, and people rarely want the truth." "I need the truth," Doug said simply. "Whatever it is." Rose studied him, her weathered face unreadable. "All right, but remember you asked for this." 2 weeks later, Rose handed Doug an envelope containing photos of Natalie entering a boutique hotel near the public garden with Blake Whitfield. Additional photos showed them leaving separately 3 hours later. Phone records showed hundreds of text messages between them. Credit card statements revealed gifts purchased by Blake for Natalie, including a Hermes handbag worth nearly $15,000. Been going on about 7 months from what I can tell, Rose said matter-of-factly. Possibly longer in terms of emotional involvement. Doug sat silently, the evidence spread before him on Rose's desk. The hurt was there, deep and searing, but alongside it grew something else, cold anger. There's more, Rose continued, sliding another document across the desk. While I was looking into Whitfield, I found something interesting. The private school his kids attend, Brunswick Academy, he doesn't actually own it. Doug looked up, momentarily confused by this tangent. The school property was purchased last year by Mercer Holdings LLC, Rose continued. Which, if I'm not mistaken, is your company. Doug stared at the document, recalling the purchase, a real estate investment he'd made through a holding company, acquiring the historic building and grounds then leasing it back to the school on favorable terms. He hadn't connected that Blake's children attended Brunswick. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man sleeping with his wife depended on Doug's property for his children's education. What are you going to do? Rose asked, watching his expression carefully. Doug gathered the photos and documents, tucking them into his briefcase. I'm going to wait. Wait for what? The right moment, Doug replied, his voice calm despite the storm building inside him. Our 10th anniversary is in 3 months. Natalie's planning a big party. It seems like an appropriate time for revelations. Rose raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. As Doug stood to leave, she offered one piece of advice. Document everything before you make any moves. People like your wife and her boyfriend. They'll try to rewrite the narrative. Doug nodded, already mentally cataloging his assets and calculating how to protect what he'd built. Natalie had chosen her path. Now he would choose his. Chapter 3, The Collapse. The evening of Doug and Natalie's 10th anniversary party arrived with perfect early summer weather. Natalie had spared no expense, transforming the rooftop garden of the Four Seasons into an elegant celebration space with views overlooking the public garden. 100 of Boston's most influential couples mingled among white floral arrangements, sipping champagne and sampling hors d'oeuvres prepared by a celebrity chef. Doug moved through the crowd with practiced politeness, accepting congratulations he knew were hollow. He'd spent the 3 months since his meeting with Rose preparing. He'd documented financial records, transferred assets, consulted discreetly with attorneys, and reinforced his business holdings against potential attack. He'd even made an appointment with a therapist, not to save his marriage, but to ensure he remained clear-headed for what was to come. You've outdone yourself, Blake Whitfield said to Natalie, loud enough for Doug to overhear from where he stood nearby, purposefully unnoticed. 10 years with our friend Doug here. You deserve some kind of medal for endurance. A few people laughed uncomfortably. Natalie shot Blake a warning glance, but smiled despite herself. Now, Blake continued, emboldened by his third scotch. I'm just saying what everyone thinks. Doug's a successful man in his particular field. But Natalie, darling, you could have had anyone. Doug watched Natalie's reaction carefully. This was her opportunity to defend their marriage, to shut down Blake's disrespect. Instead, she offered a tight smile and attempted to change the subject. Speaking of success, Blake persisted, gesturing with his glass toward Doug. I heard you just closed on that warehouse conversion in Charlestown. Blue-collar housing, is it? Very admirable. Very you. Blake. Natalie murmured warningly, placing a hand on his arm. What? Blake laughed. Doug knows I'm just having fun. Besides, we should be celebrating Natalie. 10 years putting up with a man who can't even afford that beautiful Hermes bag she's carrying. What is that, darling? About $15,000. More than our friend here spends on his entire wardrobe, I'd wager. The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. Doug set down his untouched champagne glass and walked calmly to the center of the gathering. He could see the nervous recognition in Natalie's eyes. She knew something was about to happen, but couldn't predict what. Thank you all for joining us tonight, Doug began, his voice steady. It means a lot to have so many people here to witness this moment. Relief washed over Natalie's face at what seemed like a standard anniversary speech. Blake smirked, already bored. When I met Natalie 11 years ago, I believed I'd found someone who valued authenticity, Doug continued. Someone who saw worth in hard work and character rather than appearances. I was wrong. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Natalie's face drained of color. For those wondering about Blake's comments regarding Natalie's handbag, yes, it does cost approximately $15,000. And no, I didn't buy it for her. Blake did. Doug removed photos from his jacket pocket and placed them on a nearby table, along with hotel rooms, jewelry, and whatever else my wife's affection costs these days. Doug, stop this, Natalie hissed, stepping toward him. You're embarrassing yourself. No, Natalie. For the first time in years, I'm being honest. Doug turned to address Blake directly. You mocked my career tonight. Called me blue collar, as if that's an insult. You're right that I work with my hands. I build things of value instead of manipulating numbers to create the illusion of worth. Blake's smug expression had vanished, replaced with barely contained anger. You've made your point, Mercer. Now I suggest. I'm not finished, Doug cut him off. You mentioned my recent acquisition in Charlestown, but you seem unaware of my other holdings. Like the property at 137 Marlborough Street. Recognition dawned on Blake's face. That's right, Doug continued. I own the building where your children attend Brunswick Academy. Have for nearly a year now. It's been leased back to the school on favorable terms because I believe in education, something you might want to consider about appearances versus reality. Complete silence had fallen over the party. Doug turned back to address the stunned guests. I apologize for the dramatic end to the evening, but I wanted witnesses when I gave Natalie her anniversary gift. He removed an envelope from his inside pocket and handed it to her. Divorce papers. Already filed this morning. Natalie's hands trembled as she held the envelope, shock rendering her speechless. As for Brunswick Academy, Doug continued, looking back at Blake. I've informed the board that I'll be terminating the lease agreement effective immediately. They have 90 days to relocate or purchase the property at market value, approximately triple what they're currently paying. Your children might need to find a new school, Blake. Blake lunged forward, his composure shattered. You vindictive bastard. Two security guards Doug had arranged in advance stepped forward, restraining Blake before he could reach Doug. Remove Mr. Whitfield from the premises, Doug instructed calmly, and ensure Ms. Cruz receives the bill for tonight's event. He emphasized Natalie's maiden name, already mentally removing her from his life. As Blake was escorted out, still shouting threats, Doug addressed the remaining guests one final time. Please enjoy the remainder of the evening. The bar will remain open. Consider it a parting gift from a blue-collar man who can, in fact, afford quite a lot. With that, Doug walked out, leaving behind the shattered facade of his marriage and the stunned silence of Boston's elite. In his car, parked a block away, he finally allowed himself a moment of raw emotion, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Then he started the engine and drove toward the future he would rebuild alone. Chapter 4, Fallout. Doug spent the night of his anniversary party in a sparsely furnished apartment above one of his commercial properties in South Boston. The space was utilitarian, a haven he'd prepared weeks earlier, anticipating the nuclear fallout of his public revelation. As dawn broke over the harbor, he sat at a simple wooden table, organizing the next phase of his plan while his phone accumulated missed calls and messages. The first call he answered came from his attorney, Leona Washington, a formidable litigator known for her ruthless efficiency and discretion. Well, you certainly know how to make a statement, she said dryly. I've already received 4 calls from Natalie's people. They're threatening everything from defamation to emotional distress claims. Let them, Doug replied, his voice steady. We have documentation for everything I said last night. The public nature of your announcement may complicate matters, Leona cautioned. Judges don't typically appreciate theatrical displays, even when justified. I'm prepared for that. Have the financial protections we discussed been implemented? Yes. All critical assets are secured in the trusts and LLCs we established. Natalie can fight for her share of marital assets, but she can't touch your core holdings or premarital investments. After ending the call, Doug poured himself a cup of black coffee and moved to the window overlooking the waterfront. Workers were arriving at the tech incubator he'd developed in a former manufacturing space. People building something meaningful, unaware of the personal earthquake that had just reshaped his life. His phone rang again, Rose Flanagan this time. Heard you dropped quite a bomb last night, she said without preamble. You okay? I'm fine. Bullshit, but I appreciate the stoicism. Listen, Whitfield's been making noise, called in some markers with friends at BPD, trying to get harassment charges filed against you. Nothing will stick, but he's coming after you hard. Doug had anticipated this. I'm prepared. There's more, Rose continued. Brunswick Academy's board called an emergency meeting this morning. They're scrambling to figure out options after your lease termination notice. They have 90 days, Doug said flatly. More than generous. You know those kids had nothing to do with this, right? The question pierced Doug's armor of cold determination. He'd considered this, the collateral damage to innocent students. It was the one aspect of his plan that troubled his conscience. The board has options, he replied after a moment. They can purchase the property or relocate. I'm not destroying the school, just ensuring Whitfield's children won't be attending it. Rose's silence conveyed her judgment, but she didn't press further. Just watch your back. People like Whitfield and your ex, they play dirty when cornered. After hanging up, Doug turned his attention to the dozens of messages flooding his phone. Most were from party attendees, some expressing shock, others offering awkward sympathy, many simply probing for additional gossip. Several business contacts were reaching out, clearly calculating how this public implosion might affect their dealings with him. One message caught his attention, from Walt Bennett, his first real estate agent and mentor, now in his 70s. Just heard what happened. Need to talk. Meet me at Sullivan's Diner, 1 p.m. Some things you should know. Doug arrived at the worn vinyl booth in the back of Sullivan's at precisely 1 p.m. Walt was already there, looking older than Doug remembered, nursing a cup of coffee. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Walt said as Doug slid into the seat opposite him. Had to be done, Doug replied, signaling the waitress for coffee. Maybe so, but there's something you should know about Blake Whitfield. Walt leaned forward, lowering his voice. Back when I was still working, I handled a property transaction for him, vacation home on the Cape. I saw some irregularities in his financials. The man's leverage to the hilt beneath that expensive facade. Doug raised an eyebrow. Meaning he's been playing with other people's money for years. That investment firm of his? Built on smoke and mirrors from what I could tell. He's been robbing Peter to pay Paul, staying just ahead of disaster by bringing in new clients to cover losses from existing ones. You're saying he's running a Ponzi scheme? Walt shrugged. I'm not making accusations. Just telling you what I observed. His divorce settlement nearly broke him. He's been desperate to maintain appearances since then. This information shifted something in Doug's understanding. Blake wasn't just a wealthy rival who'd stolen his wife. He was a fraud on the verge of collapse, which made him even more dangerous. Why tell me this now? Doug asked. Because you deserve to know exactly who you're dealing with, Walt replied. And because I taught you to see the real value in things, not just what's on the surface. Whatever you do next, make sure it's about justice, not just revenge. As Doug drove back to his temporary apartment, he turned Walt's words over in his mind. If Blake was truly on financial thin ice, the loss of the prestigious school connection for his children would be just one more crack in his carefully maintained facade. Doug had initially planned his revenge to cause maximum humiliation, but now he saw the potential for something more comprehensive. That evening, he received a text from an unknown number. This isn't over. You have no idea what you've started. Natalie had never been one for direct confrontation. That she was reaching out this way suggested desperation, or Blake's influence. Either way, Doug wasn't concerned. He'd anticipated their rage. What they hadn't anticipated was his preparation. His phone rang again. The headmaster of Brunswick Academy, Dr. Howard Sinclair, requesting an urgent meeting. Doug agreed to see him the following morning at his office. As expected, Dr. Sinclair arrived looking harried and concerned. Mr. Mercer, I understand you're going through a difficult personal situation, the headmaster began diplomatically, but I'm hoping we can discuss the lease termination notice. Brunswick has been at that location for over 50 years. We have 300 students whose education would be severely disrupted. Doug regarded the man carefully. Dr. Sinclair, my issue isn't with Brunswick Academy. It's with two specific students who attend your school. The Whitfield children. Dr. Sinclair nodded uncomfortably. I gathered as much from what I've heard. But surely you can appreciate that punishing an entire institution over a personal matter seems excessive. I'm not punishing the institution, Doug corrected. I'm exercising my rights as the property owner. The board has options: purchase the property or relocate. At triple the current rate, purchasing is financially impossible for us, Dr. Sinclair admitted. And relocation within 90 days is equally impossible. We'd lose our accreditation, not to mention the chaos for our families. Doug leaned back in his chair, considering. He hadn't expected to feel conflicted about this aspect of his plan, but Dr. Sinclair's genuine concern for his students was affecting him more than he'd anticipated. What if I offered a third option? Doug finally said. The lease continues at current terms, but with one condition: the Whitfield children are no longer welcome at Brunswick. Dr. Sinclair paled. You're asking me to expel innocent children over their father's actions? I'm offering you a choice, Doug corrected. Protect 2 students and displace 300, or make a difficult decision that preserves the school for everyone else. The headmaster stood, visibly disturbed. This is ethically indefensible. I can't possibly. Consider it carefully, Doug interrupted, his voice level. Discuss it with your board. You have until the end of the week to decide. After Dr. Sinclair left, Doug sat alone in his office, unexpectedly troubled by the conversation. This was the first time his revenge had extended to potentially harming innocent parties. Was he becoming what he despised, someone who used power to dominate others regardless of collateral damage? His phone rang, Leona Washington again. Natalie's lawyer reached out with a settlement offer, she informed him. She wants the brownstone, half your liquid assets, and a percentage of Mercer Holdings going forward. Doug's momentary doubt hardened back into resolve. Deny everything. She violated our prenup with the affair. She gets nothing beyond what I've already offered. That night, returning to his temporary apartment, Doug found a package waiting outside his door. Inside was a framed photo of him and Natalie from early in their relationship, the glass shattered, with a note that read simply, "Two can destroy what they've built." The threat was clear. Natalie and Blake weren't going to fade away quietly. They were declaring war. Doug picked up the broken frame, studying his younger self standing beside Natalie, both smiling with genuine happiness. He tried to pinpoint exactly when that authentic connection had died, whether it was his fault for being too focused on building his empire, or hers for being seduced by status and appearances. In the end, it didn't matter. What was broken couldn't be repaired. All that remained was to ensure he emerged from the wreckage with what mattered most: his dignity and the business he'd built from nothing. Chapter 5: Counterattack. The morning after receiving the shattered picture frame, Doug stepped out of his apartment building to find his truck's tires slashed and bastard keyed into the driver's side door. The vandalism was amateurish, emotional, Natalie's doing rather than Blake's, he suspected. Blake would have hired someone professional, someone who wouldn't leave such obvious evidence. As he arranged for the truck to be towed, Doug received a call from Rose Flanagan. You might want to check your email, she said without preamble. Particularly your work accounts. Doug pulled out his phone and found his business email had been flooded with messages from angry clients. Someone, clearly Blake, had sent a mass email from a spoofed account appearing to be Doug's, announcing dramatic rate increases for all Mercer Properties tenants, effective immediately. Damage control is already underway, Doug told Rose, forwarding the fraudulent email to his IT security team. But this is crossing a line into criminal territory. That's not all, Rose continued. There's chatter in financial circles about Mercer Holdings. Someone's spreading rumors that you're underwater financially and preparing to sell off properties at distressed prices. Doug understood the strategy: undermine his business reputation while simultaneously attacking his personal life. It was exactly what he'd expect from someone like Blake Whitfield, a man whose own success was built on manipulation and appearances. Have you considered filing for a restraining order? Rose asked. Not yet, Doug replied. That would suggest they're getting to me. Sometimes pride isn't worth the cost, Doug. The words hit closer to home than he wanted to admit. Wasn't pride, his and Natalie's, what had brought them to this point? His unwillingness to adapt to her social world, her shame over his working-class background? He pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about pride anymore. It was about protecting what he'd built from people who would destroy it out of spite and entitlement. By noon, Doug had met with his management team to address the fraudulent email, sending personal messages to every tenant assuring them their rates remained unchanged. His IT department traced the spoofed email to a public computer at the Boston Public Library, Impossible to definitively link to Blake without surveillance footage, which would require a police report he wasn't yet ready to file. As he was leaving the meeting, a text arrived from an unknown number. How does it feel to watch your reputation crumble? This is just the beginning. B. So Blake was now communicating directly rather than working through Natalie. The directness suggested escalation, and perhaps a rift between Blake and Natalie about how to proceed. Doug's suspicions were confirmed that evening when he received a call from an unexpected source, Clarissa Whitfield, Blake's ex-wife. "We've never met," she began, her voice cultured but tense. "But I believe we have a common problem." "Blake," Doug replied simply. "Indeed. I understand your wife and my ex-husband have entangled themselves, and now you've taken action that affects my children's education." Doug tensed, prepared for another attack. "I'm not discussing Brunswick Academy with." "I'm not calling to berate you," Clarissa interrupted. "I'm calling to offer information. Blake isn't who he portrays himself to be. His investment firm is essentially insolvent. He's been using new client funds to cover withdrawals from existing clients for years." This aligned with what Walt had told him, but hearing it confirmed by Blake's ex-wife added significant weight. "Why are you telling me this?" Doug asked cautiously. "Because I want to protect my children," she replied simply. "Their education at Brunswick is one of the few stable elements in their lives since the divorce. Blake is volatile when cornered. What you've done with the school property has pushed him to a dangerous place." "Dangerous how?" There was a pause before Clarissa continued, her voice lower. "During our divorce, when I threatened to expose financial irregularities I discovered, there was an incident. My brake lines were cut. It was never proven who did it, but the timing was concerning." Doug absorbed this information silently. If true, it elevated the situation from a bitter personal dispute to something potentially life-threatening. "What exactly are you proposing?" he finally asked. "A compromise," Clarissa replied. "Leave Brunswick Academy and my children out of this. In exchange, I can provide you with documentation of Blake's financial fraud, information that would be far more damaging to him than school displacement." It was a compelling offer, a more targeted form of revenge that wouldn't harm innocent children. But Doug had learned to be cautious of seemingly convenient solutions. "I'll consider it," he said noncommittally. "Send the documentation first, and we'll discuss further." After ending the call, Doug immediately contacted Rose Flanagan to run a background check on Clarissa Whitfield. If she was genuine, her information could provide a new avenue for his revenge, one that would destroy Blake without collateral damage. If she was working with Blake, however, this could be an elaborate trap. The following day brought a new complication. Doug arrived at his main office to find a group of protesters outside the building, carrying signs reading "Fair Housing Now" and "Stop Mercer's Tenant Abuse." At their center stood Natalie, looking appropriately concerned for the news cameras present. "Mr. Mercer has systematically overcharged vulnerable tenants," she was saying to a reporter when Doug approached. "As his wife, I was unaware of these practices until recently, but now I feel morally obligated to speak out." The sheer audacity of the lie stopped Doug in his tracks. Natalie had never shown the slightest interest in his tenant policies, which he'd kept intentionally affordable even as property values rose around them. "Mr. Mercer," a reporter thrust a microphone toward him. "How do you respond to allegations that you've been forcing long-term residents out of their homes through illegal rent increases?" Doug recognized the trap immediately. If he confronted Natalie publicly, he'd appear to be an angry, controlling husband lashing out at his wife. Exactly the narrative she and Blake wanted to establish. If he ignored the questions, he'd seem guilty. "My company's rental rates are a matter of public record," he replied calmly. "Anyone wishing to verify our pricing practices can access that information through proper channels. I'm proud of our commitment to fair housing and welcome any legitimate investigation." He walked past the protesters without further comment, nodding politely to security as they held the door for him. Inside, his management team was already addressing the situation, preparing statements and gathering data to refute the false claims. "Natalie knows our tenant policies inside and out," said Maria Valdez, his operations director. "She's deliberately lying." "Of course she is," Doug agreed. "She and Blake are trying to damage my reputation any way they can. They want me to react emotionally, prove I'm the villain they're painting me to be." "So what's our play?" Maria asked. Doug considered carefully. "Transparency. Release our complete rental history for the past 5 years, showing how our increases have stayed below market average. Invite tenant testimonials. And contact every community organization we've partnered with for statements about our affordable housing initiatives. By afternoon, the narrative was already shifting as media outlets received documentation contradicting Natalie's claims. Several long-term tenants had voluntarily approached reporters to defend Doug's business practices. The protest, lacking genuine grievances to sustain it, dispersed by evening. That night, Doug received the promised documentation from Clarissa Whitfield, financial records, client complaints that had been privately settled, and internal emails suggesting deliberate deception of investors. If authentic, the materials constituted evidence of serious financial crimes. This looks legitimate, Rose confirmed after reviewing the files Doug had forwarded to her. Question is, what do you do with it? Doug's initial instinct was to turn the information over to regulatory authorities immediately, but he hesitated. Using this method would destroy Blake completely, potentially landing him in prison, but would also impact innocent clients who had trusted him with their investments. There's another angle here, Rose added. If Whitfield gets wind that you have this information, it escalates the situation significantly. According to his ex-wife, he's already willing to resort to physical harm when threatened. Doug nodded, taking this sobering assessment seriously. I need to think about next steps carefully. In the meantime, I want surveillance on my properties and increased security protocols for my staff. Late that evening, Doug received another call, this time from Dr. Sinclair at Brunswick Academy. The board has made a decision regarding your proposition, the headmaster said, his voice strained. We cannot ethically expel students based on parental conflicts. However, we recognize your position as property owner, meaning we've secured temporary facilities to house our students beginning next term. It's not ideal, but it preserves our principles. Doug felt an unexpected respect for the headmaster's stance. I understand, but I'd like to offer an alternative. What if Brunswick could purchase the property at a fair market value, with favorable financing terms provided through a third party? There was a startled pause before Dr. Sinclair responded. That would certainly be preferable to relocation, but as I mentioned, the market value is beyond our means. I can arrange for a valuation that recognizes the property's educational usage rather than its potential commercial value, Doug suggested. And the financing could include a clause that if any Whitfield ever attends or is associated with the school in the future, the rate jumps to commercial terms immediately. It was a compromise that would achieve his goal without harming the broader school community. The property would still be unavailable to Blake's children, but Brunswick Academy could continue operations with minimal disruption. I would need to present this to the board, Dr. Sinclair said cautiously. Of course, let me know their decision. After hanging up, Doug stood at his apartment window, looking out at the Boston skyline. His revenge against Blake and Natalie was proceeding, but each step felt increasingly complex, the consequences radiating outward to affect others in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. His phone pinged with a message from Rose. Surveillance picked up Blake meeting with someone outside your Charlestown property. Unknown male, professional appearance. Could be harmless, could be trouble. Watch yourself. Doug nodded grimly at the warning. The battle was escalating, and he needed to remain vigilant. Whatever Blake was planning next, Doug needed to be prepared. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was becoming a fight for survival. Chapter 6. Strategic Positions. 5 days after the protest debacle, Doug met with Leona Washington in her downtown office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. The divorce proceedings had officially begun, with initial filings complete and preliminary hearings scheduled. Natalie's lawyers are pushing hard for emergency financial support, Leona informed him, sliding a document across her desk. They're claiming she has no access to funds since you cut her off after the anniversary party. Doug scanned the filing, which painted him as a vindictive husband denying his wife basic living expenses out of spite. The irony wasn't lost on him. Natalie, who had been spending lavishly on Blake Whitfield's credit cards for months, now presenting herself as financially abandoned. They're requesting temporary possession of the brownstone and $25,000 monthly in support while proceedings continue. Leona continued. Judge Harriman is assigned to the case. She tends to be sympathetic to such requests regardless of circumstances. Do we have evidence of Natalie's spending through Blake? Leona nodded. Rose provided excellent documentation. Credit card statements, hotel receipts, the works. The issue is timing. If Natalie's team pushes for emergency relief, we may not have opportunity to present that evidence before a temporary order is issued. Doug considered this carefully. What if we preempt them? Request an emergency hearing ourselves, citing evidence of Natalie's affair and independent financial means. Aggressive, Leona mused. I like it. We'll need to move quickly, though. According to my sources, they're filing for the emergency hearing tomorrow morning. As Doug left Leona's office, he received a call from Maria Valdez at Mercer Properties headquarters. We have a situation at Riverpoint Apartments, she said urgently. Some kind of hazardous materials team showed up claiming there's an asbestos contamination. They've evacuated the building and cordoned it off. Riverpoint was one of Doug's largest residential properties, a 120-unit complex he'd renovated 3 years earlier, with current occupancy at nearly 100%. An asbestos claim was nonsensical. He'd personally overseen the complete environmental remediation during renovation. Who ordered the inspection? Doug asked, already suspecting the answer. That's the thing. They claim it was an anonymous tip to the city health department. But the inspectors aren't wearing official city credentials, just generic hazmat suits and badges that don't look quite right. It's Blake, Doug said flatly. This is his countermove. Call BPD immediately and report unauthorized individuals impersonating city officials. Then contact our environmental consulting firm and get them to the property with their testing equipment. We need legitimate officials confirming there's no asbestos before our tenants spend a night displaced. By the time Doug arrived at Riverpoint, the situation had deteriorated into chaos. Residents stood in clusters on the sidewalk, many still in work clothes, others with small children or pets, all looking confused and concerned. News vans had appeared, capturing footage of hazmat-suited figures entering and exiting the building. Doug approached the police officers who had responded to Maria's call. I'm Douglas Mercer, the property owner. These people have no authorization to be in my building or to evacuate my tenants. The lead officer, a sergeant named Ramirez, looked skeptical. They presented health department credentials, sir. Check with the health department directly, Doug insisted. This is a fraudulent operation designed to damage my business. While Officer Ramirez made the call, Doug turned his attention to the gathered residents. Rather than hiding in his car or sending a representative to handle the situation, he walked directly into the crowd. I understand everyone is confused and concerned, he began, raising his voice to be heard. I want to assure you that there is no asbestos in this building. We completed full environmental remediation during renovation 3 years ago and have certification to prove it. A woman holding a toddler stepped forward. Then why are those men in hazmat suits saying we can't go back inside? My daughter's medication is in our apartment. Because someone is deliberately creating this situation to cause disruption, Doug replied honestly. I've arranged for legitimate environmental inspectors to arrive shortly to verify the building's safety. In the meantime, I've booked rooms at the Marriott 2 blocks from here for anyone needing accommodation tonight, and I'll personally escort anyone who needs to retrieve essential items from their apartments. His straightforward approach and immediate solutions seemed to calm the crowd somewhat. As he continued addressing tenant concerns individually, Officer Ramirez approached. Health Department has no record of ordering an inspection here, the officer confirmed. I've called for additional units to remove these individuals and secure the building. Within an hour, the fake inspectors were being escorted from the property in handcuffs, refused to identify who had hired them. The building was being officially cleared by legitimate environmental experts, and tenants were gradually returning to their apartments. The news crews, initially eager for a story about dangerous living conditions, were now reporting on an apparent fraud perpetrated against Mercer Properties and its residents. As the situation stabilized, Doug received a text from an unknown number. Round 1 to you. Hope you enjoy the headlines tomorrow. This is just beginning. B. The threat confirmed Doug's suspicions about who was behind the false asbestos claim. Blake was escalating, moving from reputation attacks to actively disrupting Doug's business operations and potentially endangering his tenants. The gloves were truly off now. The following morning, as predicted, the incident made headlines, but not in the way Blake had likely intended. Property owner foils fraudulent hazmat scam, read the Boston Herald. Mercer praised for swift response to tenant crisis, declared the Globe. The accompanying photos showed Doug helping elderly residents back into their building and personally distributing hotel vouchers to those who preferred to wait for official clearance. Not quite the PR disaster Whitfield was hoping for, Rose commented when Doug called to update her. But be careful, he's going to be furious that this backfired. I know. That's why I need you to accelerate the background investigation into his financial dealings. Clarissa Whitfield's documents are a start, but I need more concrete evidence that can't be dismissed as ex-wife vengeance. Already on it, Rose confirmed. I've got contacts at 3 regulatory agencies making discreet inquiries. But this brings me to another concern. I've been monitoring chatter about potential physical threats. There's a guy Blake's been seen with, former military, works private security now. Not someone you want showing up uninvited. I'll increase personal security measures, Doug promised, though the thought of needing bodyguards in his own city rankled him. This wasn't how he'd envisioned his life playing out. Later that morning, Doug attended the emergency hearing his legal team had requested regarding Natalie's financial claims. Judge Harriman, a stern woman in her 60s, regarded both parties with evident disapproval as Leona presented evidence of Natalie's affair and independent financial resources. What we have here, Your Honor, Leona concluded, is not a situation where Mrs. Mercer requires emergency support, but rather an attempt to extract unwarranted funds while proceedings continue. Natalie's attorney, a polished man named Gregory Phillips, countered with practiced indignation. My client's personal relationships, whatever they may be, do not negate Mr. Mercer's obligation to support his wife of 10 years. The prenuptial agreement Mrs. Mercer signed under duress specifically. Under duress? Leona interrupted incredulously. Mrs. Mercer had independent legal counsel review the agreement for 3 weeks before signing. There are 6 witnesses to her voluntary signature. Judge Harriman raised a hand to silence both attorneys. I've reviewed the evidence presented by both sides. While I find Mr. Mercer's public revelation of private matters at the anniversary party to be unnecessarily theatrical, the documentation regarding Mrs. Mercer's financial activities is compelling. She turned to Natalie, who sat with perfect posture but visible anxiety. Mrs. Mercer, the court cannot in good conscience order emergency financial support when evidence suggests you have access to substantial resources through your companion. The request for temporary possession of the marital home is similarly denied pending further proceedings. Next hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. As they left the courtroom, Doug noticed Blake waiting in the hallway, his expression thunderous. He'd clearly expected a different outcome from the hearing. This isn't over, Mercer, Blake said quietly as Doug passed him. You're playing a game you don't understand against people who can destroy everything you've built. Doug paused, meeting Blake's gaze directly. That's where you're wrong, Whitfield. I built everything I have from nothing. You were born into privilege and have been faking your way through life ever since. I know exactly what game we're playing and what the stakes are. Blake's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Natalie emerged from the courtroom and pulled him away, whispering urgently. Doug watched them leave, noting the tension in their interaction. The pressure was beginning to strain their relationship, exactly as he'd anticipated. That evening, Doug received a call from Dr. Sinclair at Brunswick Academy. The board has voted to accept your purchase offer, the headmaster informed him, with the condition regarding future Whitfield attendance clearly stipulated. We appreciate your willingness to find a solution that allows the school to continue operations. I'll have the paperwork drawn up immediately, Doug replied, feeling a sense of satisfaction at reaching a reasonable conclusion to at least one aspect of this conflict. The Whitfield children would need to find a new school, but Brunswick Academy would continue serving its other students without disruption. As Doug ended the call, his security system alerted him to movement on the property surrounding his temporary apartment. The camera feed showed 2 figures in dark clothing approaching from the rear of the building. Acting quickly, Doug triggered the silent alarm connected directly to BPD and moved away from windows, positioning himself near the reinforced bathroom, where he'd installed a small safe containing a licensed handgun. Within minutes, police sirens approached, and the figures retreated hastily into the darkness. Whether they had been common burglars or something more sinister, Perhaps the former military associate Rose had mentioned. Doug couldn't be certain. What was clear was that the conflict with Blake and Natalie had entered a potentially violent phase. The next morning, Doug made two significant decisions. First, he formally reported the suspected harassment and potential physical threats to BPD, filing for a restraining order against both Blake and Natalie. Second, he authorized Rose to turn over the financial evidence they had gathered about Blake's investment schemes to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Once this is submitted, there's no going back, Rose warned. The SEC takes these allegations seriously, and if they find sufficient evidence, Blake could face criminal charges. I understand, Doug replied. But this has gone beyond personal revenge. Blake's actions are endangering my tenants, my employees, and potentially my life. It needs to end. The chess pieces were all in position now. Doug had protected his assets, secured his properties, addressed the Brunswick Academy situation with minimal collateral damage, blocked Natalie's financial claims, and set in motion the investigation that could bring Blake's financial house of cards crashing down. All that remained was to wait for the final confrontation, and to be prepared for whatever desperate measures Blake and Natalie might attempt as their options narrowed. Chapter 7. Desperation Moves. 3 days after Doug filed the SEC complaint against Blake's investment firm, the first tremors of financial panic began to ripple through Boston's elite circles. Though the SEC investigation remained confidential at this stage, the mere fact that investigators had been seen at Whitfield Investment Partners' offices was enough to trigger nervous inquiries from clients. Doug learned of these developments through Walt Bennett, who still maintained connections throughout the financial community despite his retirement. Word is spreading that something's amiss at Whitfield's firm, Walt reported during their meeting at a quiet cafe in Cambridge. Several major clients have requested immediate liquidation of their portfolios. Blake's scrambling to meet the withdrawal demands. Has he been able to comply? Doug asked, knowing that in a Ponzi scheme, a rush of withdrawals typically triggered collapse. Partially, he's selling off his personal assets, vacation properties, art collection. Even his Beacon Hill home is quietly on the market. But it won't be enough if the withdrawals continue. The knowledge that Blake was liquidating his life to stay afloat should have brought Doug satisfaction. This was, after all, exactly what he'd intended when he set the SEC investigation in motion. Yet the victory felt hollow somehow, tainted by the broader destruction his revenge was causing. What about his clients? Doug asked. People who invested with him in good faith? Walt sighed heavily. Most will lose significantly. Insurance will cover some losses, but not all. That's the nature of these schemes. By the time they unravel, much of the money is already gone. Doug nodded grimly. His revenge against Blake was proving effective, but the collateral damage weighed on him unexpectedly. He'd wanted justice, not to become the architect of widespread financial ruin for innocent investors. Later that day, Doug arrived at his Charlestown development site to find his construction foreman, Mike Russo, waiting with concerned expression. Building inspector showed up this morning, Mike reported. Said there'd been complaints about code violations. Spent 3 hours going over everything with a fine-tooth comb. And, Doug prompted, suspecting another of Blake's attempts at sabotage. Found nothing major, couple of minor issues we're already addressing. But he mentioned something odd. Said the complaint came from someone claiming to be a former employee alleging systematic code violations across all your properties. Doug's jaw tightened. Another attack on his business reputation, likely orchestrated by Blake in retaliation for the SEC investigation. This one, however, held little threat. His properties were built properly, with inspections documented at every phase. Keep proceeding as planned, Doug instructed Mike. If more inspectors show up, give them full access and cooperation. We have nothing to hide. As Doug was leaving the site, his phone rang. Natalie's number, the first direct contact since the anniversary party confrontation. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. We need to talk, Natalie said, her voice lacking its usual poise. In person, without lawyers. I don't think that's wise, Doug replied cautiously. Please, she said, and the rare note of genuine emotion in her voice gave him pause. Things have gotten out of control. I never wanted it to go this far. Against his better judgment, and certainly against what Leona would advise, Doug agreed to meet Natalie at a public cafe near the public garden a location visible enough to deter any potential confrontation. When he arrived, Natalie was already seated at an outdoor table, sunglasses concealing her eyes despite the overcast day. She looked thinner than he remembered, her customary perfect appearance showing subtle signs of strain. "Thank you for coming," she said as he sat down across from her. "I know you have every reason to refuse." "What do you want, Natalie?" Doug asked directly, unwilling to engage in social niceties. She removed her sunglasses, revealing reddened eyes. "I want this to stop. All of it. The legal battles, the business attacks, the SEC investigation. It's destroying everyone involved." "You and Blake started this," Doug reminded her. "The affair, the public humiliation, the attempts to undermine my business and reputation." "I know," she acknowledged, surprising him with her directness. "But Blake's not stable right now. The SEC investigation has him panicking. He's talking about leaving the country, about desperate measures. I'm afraid of what he might do." Doug studied her carefully, looking for signs of manipulation. Was this a genuine warning or simply another strategy to get him to call off the SEC? "Why are you telling me this? Shouldn't you be planning your escape with him?" Natalie laughed bitterly. "Blake has made it clear that his priority is self-preservation. Once his financial situation became precarious, his interest in maintaining our relationship diminished considerably." The revelation didn't surprise Doug. Blake had pursued Natalie when she represented social status and access. With his own standing threatened, she had likely become a liability rather than an asset. "I made a terrible mistake," Natalie continued, her voice dropping. "I betrayed you for someone who ultimately valued me even less than you did." The comment stung unexpectedly. "I valued you, Natalie. But I couldn't become the person you wanted me to be without losing myself in the process." "I know that now," she said softly. Too late, obviously. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Two people who had once shared everything now connected only by mutual pain and resentment. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Doug finally asked. "Call off the SEC investigation. Give Blake a chance to resolve the client issues privately. In exchange, he'll cease all actions against you and your business. I'll accept whatever divorce terms you offer without contest." Doug considered her proposal. The SEC investigation was his most potent weapon against Blake, one that threatened not just his reputation, but his freedom. Withdrawing it would mean surrendering his best leverage. "How do I know this isn't just another tactic?" he asked. "That you and Blake won't resume your attacks once the SEC pressure is lifted?" "You don't," Natalie admitted. "You have no reason to trust me. But I'm telling you that Blake is unpredictable right now. Dangerous. This could end badly for everyone involved." As Doug weighed his response, his phone buzzed with a text from Rose Flanagan. "Urgent. Blake's associate was just picked up by BPD, illegal weapons charge. Mentioned your name during booking. Call me immediately." The message confirmed Natalie's warning about Blake's increasingly desperate state. If he was resorting to armed associates, the situation had escalated beyond business rivalry into genuine physical danger. "I need to go," Doug said, standing abruptly. "I'll consider what you've said." "Doug," Natalie called as he began to walk away. "Be careful. I don't want to see you hurt, despite everything." He nodded without turning back, unsure whether her concern was genuine or merely another performance. Either way, the warning aligned with the threat Rose had just identified. When Doug called Rose from his car, her typically composed voice carried unmistakable urgency. "The guy BPD arrested is Ray Donner, former Special Forces, working private security, mostly for clients who don't mind methods that skirt legality. He was picked up with an unregistered weapon after a traffic stop. During processing, he mentioned your name, said something about a job that wasn't finished. Direct connection to Blake? Nothing concrete yet, but they're looking." Donner's phone records show multiple calls with a burner number that also contacted Whitfield's office line. Doug processed this information alongside Natalie's warning. Blake's feeling cornered by the SEC investigation. Natalie claims he's becoming unstable, talking about desperate measures. "I believe it," Rose replied grimly. "Men like Whitfield, they can't handle losing their status. It's their entire identity. When that's threatened, they sometimes make catastrophic choices." Doug spent the remainder of the day implementing additional security measures, changing his routines, installing extra surveillance at his properties, and arranging for a security professional to sweep his vehicles and offices for tampering or listening devices. That evening, as he reviewed security footage from his properties, Doug's phone rang with a call from Leona, Washington. "We've received a settlement offer from Natalie's attorneys," she informed him. "Surprisingly reasonable. She's requesting only her personal possessions from the brownstone, a one-time payment of $500,000, and to retain her car. No ongoing support, no claim on your business assets." The terms aligned with what Natalie had suggested during their cafe meeting, a clean break with minimal demands. It was suspiciously generous given her initial aggressive stance. "What's your assessment?" Doug asked. "Honestly, I think she's cutting her losses. With the evidence of her affair and the prenup violations, she knows she won't get much more through litigation. And the longer this drags on, the more her reputation suffers. This way, she walks away with enough to restart elsewhere with some dignity intact." The explanation made logical sense, yet Doug remained wary. "Draw up acceptance documents, but don't file yet. I want to see how the next few days play out first." The following morning brought news that confirmed Doug's reluctance to trust Natalie's apparent surrender. The Boston Globe business section carried a feature article titled, "Questions Surround Mercer Properties Financing," a thinly veiled suggestion of financial impropriety that quoted sources close to the company's operations. Though the article contained no specific allegations, the implications were clear that Doug's business success might rest on questionable financial practices. The timing and content suggested Blake had planted the story as yet another attack on Doug's reputation. Doug's team moved quickly to counter the insinuations, releasing full financial audits that had been prepared in anticipation of such attacks. By afternoon, the Globe had published a follow-up piece acknowledging Mercer Properties' unusual transparency in addressing concerns and noting the company's clean audit history. As Doug was reviewing the media response in his office, his private line rang, a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Mercer," came a formal voice on the other end. "This is Special Agent Rivera with the Securities and Exchange Commission. We'd like to arrange a meeting regarding the complaints you filed about Whitfield Investment Partners." The timing was significant. The SEC was moving forward with their investigation despite the attempted media diversion. Doug agreed to meet with investigators the following morning. That evening, returning to his fortified apartment, Doug found a package waiting that had bypassed building security, a clear breach of his protective measures. Inside was a USB drive and a note in unfamiliar handwriting. "If you want to know who's really pulling the strings, watch this. Not everyone is who they appear to be." Against all security protocols, curiosity drove Doug to insert the drive into an isolated laptop he kept for reviewing potentially compromised materials. The drive contained a single video file, security footage from what appeared to be a hotel lobby, showing Natalie in intense conversation with a woman he recognized with shock, Clarissa Whitfield, Blake's ex-wife. The footage was dated 2 weeks ago, while after Clarissa had provided Doug with the financial documents about Blake's business and claimed to be acting independently out of concern for her children. The women's body language suggested collaboration rather than animosity. Doug immediately called Rose. "I need everything you can find on Clarissa Whitfield's current financial situation and any connections to Natalie," he instructed. "I think we may have been played from multiple angles." "Already looking into it," Rose replied. "After your suspicions about the settlement offer, I started digging deeper. Preliminary findings suggest Clarissa's divorce settlement from Blake included significant Whitfield Investment Partners holdings. If the firm collapses, she loses everything too," Doug finished, the pieces clicking into place. "So she and Natalie may be working together to salvage what they can from Blake's sinking ship." "It's a theory worth investigating," Rose agreed. "I'll have more for you by morning." As Doug hung up, he realized the complexity of what he faced. This wasn't simply a betrayed husband against a cheating wife and her lover. It was a multi-layered chess match with shifting alliances and hidden motives. Clarissa, who had positioned herself as an ally against Blake, might actually be working with Natalie to manipulate the situation for their mutual benefit. The question was, what was their actual endgame? And how did it affect his plans for justice against Blake and Natalie? The answers would need to wait until morning. For now, Doug reinforced his security protocols and prepared for his meeting with the SEC, a meeting that could accelerate Blake's downfall regardless of whatever scheme Natalie and Clarissa might be orchestrating. Chapter 8, Revelations. The SEC's Boston field office occupied several floors in a nondescript federal building downtown. Doug arrived for his 9 a.m. meeting with Special Agent Rivera with a thick portfolio of documents. Both the materials Clarissa had provided and additional evidence Rose had gathered about Whitfield Investment Partners' suspicious financial activities. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Mercer," said Agent Rivera, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor. "We've been reviewing your initial complaint, and there are some areas we'd like to discuss further." For the next 2 hours, Doug walked the SEC team through the documentation, explaining the patterns he and Rose had identified: client funds being moved between accounts to create the illusion of investment returns, new investor money being used to pay withdrawals from established clients, and Blake's personal expenses being funded directly from business accounts. "This is compelling," Agent Rivera acknowledged as they concluded. "Consistent with what our preliminary investigation has uncovered." Mr. Whitfield was brought in for questioning yesterday, but declined to answer substantial questions without his attorney present. "So you're proceeding with the investigation?" Doug confirmed. "Absolutely. Based on what we're seeing, this could be one of the largest financial fraud cases in Boston in recent years. We've already frozen certain accounts and will likely expand those actions as we gather more evidence." As Doug left the meeting, he felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that Blake would face consequences for his financial crimes, concern about the collateral damage to innocent investors, and lingering questions about Natalie and Clarissa's apparent collaboration. Those questions multiplied when he checked his messages to find Rose had sent her overnight findings. Clarissa Whitfield received 22% ownership in Whitfield Investments as part of divorce settlement 3 years ago. Monthly income approximately $175,000 from firm profits. She stands to lose approximately $11 million if firm collapses. Also found evidence of multiple meetings between her and Natalie going back 3 months, well before your anniversary confrontation. The timeline was significant. Natalie and Clarissa had been meeting before Doug had publicly exposed the affair, before he'd taken any action against Blake. Their collaboration wasn't a reaction to his revenge, it preceded it. But what was their objective? If Clarissa stood to lose millions from Blake's downfall, why had she provided Doug with the very evidence that could trigger that collapse? Unless the evidence itself was part of a larger strategy. Doug called Rose immediately. "The documentation Clarissa provided about Blake's firm. We need to verify it independently. Every transaction, account number, date." "Already on it," Rose replied. "Initial review shows most documents appear legitimate, but there are inconsistencies in some of the more damaging materials. Several account numbers don't match other records, and some transaction dates fall on weekends when markets were closed." She gave us enough legitimate material to make the fabricated evidence credible, Doug realized. The question is why? What would Clarissa gain from Blake being investigated but ultimately cleared of the worst allegations? "Leverage," Rose suggested. "If Blake faces serious but not catastrophic charges, he'd be vulnerable to settlement demands from multiple parties, including his ex-wife." The theory made sense, but Doug suspected there was more to the story. And Natalie's role in this? Why collaborate with her husband's ex-wife? "That's where it gets interesting," Rose continued. "Looks like Natalie's been quietly liquidating joint assets over the past year. Small withdrawals from accounts you rarely monitor, selling jewelry and artwork when you were traveling. She's amassed nearly $2 million in a private account." The revelation hit Doug harder than expected. Natalie's betrayal hadn't begun with the affair. It had been calculated and systematic, planned over months or possibly years. "There's more," Rose added. "Found an LLC registered in Natalie's maiden name that purchased a commercial property in Miami 6 months ago. Guess who the tenant is? A subsidiary of Whitfield Investment Partners." The pieces were fitting together into a disturbing picture. Natalie hadn't simply fallen for Blake's charm. She'd been strategically positioning herself financially, preparing for a planned exit from their marriage. The affair might have been genuine, but it existed within a broader scheme of financial self-preservation. As Doug processed these revelations, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Doug Mercer," he answered cautiously. "Mr. Mercer, this is Howard Lambert, Brunswick Academy Board Chair," came an agitated voice. "We have a situation requiring your immediate attention." Clarissa Whitfield has just announced a substantial donation to the school, $5 million for a new science center, with the condition that her children remain enrolled regardless of ownership changes. Doug immediately recognized the move for what it was, a direct challenge to his arrangement with Brunswick that would exclude the Whitfield children. Clarissa was using her financial leverage to circumvent his revenge against Blake. The donation is contingent on the board rejecting your purchase offer, Lambert continued uncomfortably. Several board members are inclined to accept, given the significant benefit to the school. I understand, Doug replied, keeping his voice even despite his frustration. When is the board voting? Emergency session this afternoon at 3 p.m. I'll be there, Doug assured him, already formulating his countermove. After ending the call, Doug immediately contacted his financial team to prepare documents for a competing offer to Brunswick Academy. Not just a favorable purchase arrangement, but a substantial endowment that would secure the school's future while maintaining the exclusion of Blake's children. By the time Doug arrived at Brunswick's administrative offices that afternoon, he had a comprehensive proposal ready, one that would be difficult for even the most financially motivated board members to reject. The board meeting was tense, with Clarissa Whitfield herself present, looking polished and confident. She offered Doug a slight smile when he entered, the smile of someone who believed they held the winning hand. Mr. Mercer, Ms. Whitfield, Board Chair Lambert began, visibly uncomfortable. We've called this session to address the conflicting proposals regarding Brunswick Academy's future. Ms. Whitfield has offered a $5 million donation with certain conditions, while Mr. Mercer has our existing purchase agreement with different conditions. Clarissa spoke first, her voice carrying the practiced charm of Boston's old money elite. My only concern is educational continuity for my children and their classmates. Mr. Mercer's personal vendetta against my ex-husband shouldn't deprive innocent students of their school community. When Doug's turn came, he placed his folder on the conference table and spoke directly to the board members rather than responding to Clarissa's provocations. Brunswick Academy has served this community for over 50 years. Its future shouldn't depend on individual family conflicts or short-term financial considerations. That's why I'm proposing not just the purchase arrangement we've discussed, but the establishment of a $10 million endowment to ensure Brunswick's long-term stability and academic excellence. Murmurs spread through the board members as Doug continued. This endowment would fund scholarships for deserving students who couldn't otherwise afford Brunswick's tuition, facility improvements beyond the science center Ms. Whitfield proposed, and faculty development programs. The financial scope of Doug's offer clearly surprised both the board and Clarissa, whose composure momentarily slipped. There would still be one condition, Doug concluded. The Whitfield children would need to find alternative education arrangements. However, the endowment would include specific funding for transition scholarships to help any displaced students, including the Whitfields, secure placement at comparable institutions. The balance Doug had struck was deliberate, maintaining his core objective of removing Blake's children from the school while mitigating the harm to the innocent students and offering Clarissa a face-saving alternative. After both presentations, the board requested privacy for deliberations. Doug and Clarissa waited in separate rooms, neither speaking to the other despite their physical proximity. An hour later, Lambert summoned them both back to the conference room. The board has reached a unanimous decision, he announced. We will accept Mr. Mercer's purchase and endowment proposal, with the modification that all current students, including the Whitfield children, may complete the current academic year before any enrollment changes take effect. This provides fair notice for families to make alternative arrangements. It was a reasonable compromise that accomplished Doug's principal goal while allowing for a humane transition. He nodded his acceptance while Clarissa maintained a rigid smile that didn't reach her eyes. As they left the meeting, Clarissa fell into step beside Doug in the parking lot. Congratulations on your victory, she said, her tone conversational despite the circumstance. Though I suspect it's less satisfying than you anticipated. This was never about satisfaction, Doug replied evenly. No. Clarissa raised an eyebrow. Then what was it about, really? Justice? Revenge? Or just the need to prove you could beat Blake at his own game? Speaking of games, Doug countered, yours has been interesting to uncover. The collaborative meetings with Natalie, the doctored financial evidence, the strategic positioning. What exactly were you hoping to achieve? For a moment, genuine surprise registered on Clarissa's face before she recovered her poise. "You're more thorough than we anticipated," she acknowledged, "though not entirely accurate in your assessment." "Enlighten me," Doug suggested as they reached their respective vehicles. Clarissa studied him for a moment before answering. "Blake destroyed my life once. I wasn't going to let him do it again through his financial implosion. And Natalie, well, she recognized the same pattern beginning in her own marriage. We found common cause. In manipulating me to achieve your financial goals," Doug finished. "In surviving men who view women as extensions of themselves rather than autonomous beings," Clarissa corrected. "Blake saw me as a social accessory. You saw Natalie as the grateful recipient of your generosity, the hospital administrator you elevated to society wife. Neither of you recognized what we sacrificed to fit your narratives." The perspective was unexpected and uncomfortably insightful. Doug had never considered how his own view of his marriage might mirror Blake's entitled attitude in certain ways. "The difference," Doug said after a moment, "is that I never betrayed Natalie. I never lied to her or manipulated her." "No," Clarissa agreed. "You just expected her to remain eternally grateful for the life you provided, never questioning whether it fulfilled her own ambitions or identity." With that parting observation, she entered her car and drove away, leaving Doug unsettled by the conversation. Despite winning the Brunswick Academy confrontation, he felt a growing uncertainty about the righteousness of his campaign against Blake and Natalie. Were his actions truly about justice, or were they, as Clarissa suggested, about wounded pride and control? These questions followed him back to his office, where Rose Flanagan waited with urgent news. "SEC has expanded their investigation into Whitfield Investments," she reported. "They've frozen all company and personal accounts associated with Blake. But there's a complication. Blake himself has disappeared." "Disappeared how?" Doug asked, alarmed. "Failed to appear for a scheduled follow-up interview with investigators this morning. His home appears hastily vacated, passport missing, car still in the garage. Early signs suggest he may have fled. If Blake had indeed run, it validated the seriousness of his financial crimes while potentially complicating Doug's quest for justice. A fugitive Blake would face eventual consequences but might temporarily escape the public reckoning Doug had envisioned." "What about Natalie?" "Any contact?" "Nothing since your cafe meeting," Rose confirmed. "Though her attorney filed the settlement acceptance this morning. Apparently they're proceeding despite your instructions to wait." The move suggested Natalie was accelerating her own plans, perhaps in response to Blake's disappearance. If Blake had fled without her, it confirmed what she'd implied during their cafe meeting, that his commitment to her had been contingent on her utility to his lifestyle and image. As Doug considered these developments, his phone rang with a call from Leona Washington. "We have a situation," his attorney began without preamble. "Judge Harriman has scheduled an emergency hearing for tomorrow morning. Natalie's team is claiming you've been concealing assets and engaging in financial maneuvers to deprive her of fair settlement." "That's absurd," Doug responded. "Everything I've done has been to protect legitimate premarital assets from her claims." "They're presenting documentation suggesting otherwise," Leona continued grimly. "Bank transfers, property records, offshore accounts, material suggesting you've been systematically hiding wealth for years." The nature of the evidence immediately struck Doug as suspicious. This sounds like a fabrication similar to what Clarissa attempted with the SEC documentation about Blake. "Possibly," Leona agreed. "But Judge Harriman is taking it seriously enough to schedule the hearing. We need to prepare a comprehensive response by tomorrow." After ending the call, Doug contacted his financial team to begin assembling the records that would refute Natalie's claims. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was now defending himself against the very type of financial misconduct allegations he had leveraged against Blake. That evening, as Doug worked late in his office reviewing documentation for the hearing, the building's security system alerted him to an unauthorized entry. The surveillance feed showed a figure in the stairwell approaching his floor, a woman he recognized immediately as Natalie. Against his better judgment, Doug disabled the automatic security alert to police. Whatever Natalie's purpose in coming here, he wanted to hear it directly. When she knocked on his office door minutes later, he called for her to enter. She appeared disheveled by her standards, still elegant, but with the frayed edges of someone under immense strain. How did you get past building security? Doug asked, remaining seated behind his desk. I still had the access card you gave me last year, Natalie replied, her voice subdued. You never deactivated it. An oversight Doug noted mentally to correct immediately. Why are you here, Natalie? We have nothing to discuss that can't go through our attorneys. Blake's gone, she said simply, sinking into the chair across from his desk. Disappeared with whatever assets he could liquidate before the SEC freeze. Left me to deal with the aftermath, including the false financial allegations against me scheduled for tomorrow's hearing, Doug suggested pointedly. Natalie had the grace to look uncomfortable. That was Blake's final play before he ran. He had documents prepared, forgeries good enough to pass initial scrutiny. I didn't know he was planning to flee. And now that he has, what's your plan? She met his gaze directly for the first time. To stop this destructive cycle before it consumes everything. The hearing tomorrow, the counter-accusations, the legal battles that could drag on for years. What's the point? Blake's gone. Your revenge against him will come through the federal charges, not through me or his children. There was logic in her assessment, though Doug remained wary of her motives. You collaborated with Clarissa Whitfield for months. Liquidated assets behind my back. Participated in Blake's attempts to undermine my business and reputation. Why should I believe you want to end this now? Because I'm tired, Natalie admitted, a rare moment of genuine vulnerability breaking through her composed exterior. Tired of pretending, manipulating, calculating every move. I made terrible choices, Doug. Choices I can't undo. But I can choose to stop making things worse. Doug studied her, trying to discern truth from tactical positioning. His instinct for reading people, honed through years of business negotiations, suggested her exhaustion, at least, was genuine. What exactly are you proposing, he asked. I'll withdraw the allegations scheduled for tomorrow's hearing. Accept the settlement terms you initially offered, my personal possessions, and enough funds to restart elsewhere. In exchange, you allow the Brunswick arrangement to proceed as the board decided, letting Blake's children finish the school year before transferring. The terms were reasonable, essentially concluding their conflict with minimal further damage on either side. Yet Doug hesitated, suspecting a hidden agenda. And Clarissa's role in this proposal? She doesn't know I'm here, Natalie admitted. Her agenda was always protecting her children and her financial interests in Blake's firm. Mine has become simply ending this chapter and moving on. Something in her defeated posture and straightforward admission resonated with Doug's own growing fatigue with the conflict. The initial satisfaction of his public confrontation at the anniversary party had faded, replaced by the draining reality of protracted legal battles and constant vigilance against Blake's retaliatory measures. I'll consider it, Doug finally said. But I'll need the fabricated documents withdrawn formally before the hearing, with an acknowledgement on record that they were fraudulent. Natalie nodded, standing to leave. At the door, she paused. For what it's worth, I did love you once. Before I lost sight of what actually mattered. Doug offered no response as she left, her words stirring complicated emotions he wasn't ready to examine. Instead, he returned to the financial documentation, continuing preparations for a hearing that might now be unnecessary. The real question remaining wasn't about Natalie's settlement or even Blake's eventual capture by authorities. It was about what victory in this conflict actually meant for Doug himself, and whether destroying his adversaries would truly provide the justice he had sought when this all began. Chapter 9, Reconstruction. 6 months after Blake Whitfield's disappearance, Doug stood on the rooftop of his newest development, a mixed-use building in South Boston that combined affordable housing units with retail spaces and a community center. The autumn air carried a crisp edge, promising the approaching New England winter, but the rooftop garden was still vibrant with late-season plantings. The final inspections are complete, Maria Valdez reported, consulting her tablet. We're cleared for occupancy next month. The waiting list for the residential units is already 3 times capacity. Doug nodded with satisfaction. This project represented something new for Mercer Properties, a deliberate focus on community development rather than just financial return. The shift in priority had emerged gradually from the ashes of his personal conflict with Blake and Natalie, a recalibration of what success truly meant to him. Have we confirmed the daycare operator for the ground floor space? He asked, glancing toward the glass-enclosed area visible from their vantage point. Yes, contract signed yesterday. They're particularly excited about the scholarship program for low-income families. The scholarship program had been Doug's personal addition to the project, funded from the settlement he'd received after the Brunswick Academy Board had attempted to renege on their agreement following Blake's disappearance. The subsequent lawsuit had resulted in both a financial settlement and the fulfillment of their original agreement, now modified to exclude only Blake himself from any involvement with the school rather than his children. This compromise had come after considerable reflection on Doug's part about the purpose and limits of his revenge. Blake's children, as Rose had pointedly observed months earlier, were innocent parties in their father's misdeeds. Punishing them had begun to feel like a hollow victory rather than justice. As Maria departed for another meeting, Doug's phone rang with a call from Rose Flanagan. "Thought you'd want to know immediately," she began without preamble. "Interpol found Blake in Montenegro this morning. He's being processed for extradition to face the SEC charges." The news represented the final piece of the justice Doug had sought when he'd first discovered Natalie's affair. Blake would face legal consequences for his financial crimes, losing the wealth and status he'd valued above all else. "Thanks for letting me know," Doug replied, surprised by his own muted reaction to the news. 6 months ago, he would have felt triumphant. Now, he felt primarily relief that a chapter was closing. "You don't sound as satisfied as I expected," Rose observed with her characteristic directness. "I'm satisfied that he'll face consequences for what he did to his clients," Doug clarified. "The personal aspect, that feels less important now." After ending the call, Doug remained on the rooftop, reflecting on the tumultuous year behind him. The divorce from Natalie had been finalized 3 months earlier, with both parties adhering to the settlement terms they'd negotiated the night she'd appeared in his office. She'd relocated to Chicago, according to Walt, who still maintained occasional contact with her. The Miami property connection with Whitfield Investments had ultimately cost her significantly when the firm's assets were seized by the federal government. Clarissa Whitfield had fared better, having successfully distanced herself from Blake's financial improprieties while securing continued education for her children at Brunswick Academy. The last Doug had heard, she'd remarried and moved to Connecticut, maintaining only her Boston property for her children's school access. As for Doug himself, the experience had transformed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The vengeful fury that had driven him in the aftermath of the anniversary party confrontation had gradually given way to a more reflective assessment of his own life and priorities. His business continued to thrive, but he'd redirected significant resources toward community development projects like the one he now surveyed. The savage satisfaction he'd initially sought in destroying Blake and Natalie had been replaced by a more constructive desire to build something meaningful from the wreckage of his personal life. A text message interrupted his thoughts from Walt Bennett, asking to meet for their now regular weekly lunch. Doug had reconnected with his mentor in the months following the conflict's resolution, finding valuable perspective in the older man's wisdom. When Doug arrived at Sullivan's Diner an hour later, Walt was already seated in their usual booth, coffee mug in hand. "Heard they caught Blake," Walt said as Doug slid into the seat opposite him. "Figured you'd be opening champagne." Doug shrugged. "I'm glad he'll face justice for what he did to his investors. The rest, it matters less than it once did." Walt studied him with knowing eyes. "That's called growth, son. Revenge is a powerful motivator, but a poor foundation for rebuilding." Speaking of rebuilding, Doug changed the subject. "The South Boston project passed final inspections today. We're on track for the December opening." "Good work," Walt nodded approvingly. "Your father would have been proud of that one. Something that serves people, not just profit margins." The mention of his father, who had passed away 2 years before the collapse of Doug's marriage, struck a chord. The older Mercer had been a man who valued honest work and lasting impact over wealth or status. In many ways, Doug had lost sight of those values during his marriage to Natalie, seduced by the validation of financial success. "I've been thinking about what's next," Doug admitted. "Beyond property development." "Oh," Walt raised an eyebrow, curious. "I'm considering establishing a foundation focused on trade education and affordable housing initiatives, using some of the Brunswick settlement funds as seed money." Walt's weathered face broke into a genuine smile. "Now that sounds like the Doug Mercer I first met. The one who saw potential where others saw only problems." After lunch, Doug drove to a location he hadn't visited in months. the brownstone in Back Bay he had once shared with Natalie. He'd kept the property after the divorce, but had been leasing it to a visiting professor from MIT. The tenant's contract had ended the previous week, and Doug had arranged for a cleaning service before deciding the property's future. As he unlocked the door and stepped inside, memories flooded back, both pleasant and painful. The space where they'd hosted dinner parties for Natalie's social circle. The study where he'd worked late into the night on property acquisitions. The bedroom where they'd gradually become strangers despite sharing the same space. Moving through the empty rooms, Doug felt neither nostalgia nor bitterness, just acknowledgement of a chapter concluded. He'd come to recognize that while Natalie's betrayal had been real and damaging, the foundation of their marriage had been cracking long before Blake Whitfield appeared. They had built a relationship on incompatible expectations and unspoken compromises that neither truly wanted to maintain. His phone rang. Leona Washington, his attorney. Final paperwork on the Brunswick Academy endowment is ready for your signature, she informed him. And I've reviewed the foundation charter you proposed. The structure is sound, though I've suggested some governance modifications for long-term sustainability. Thanks, Leona. I'll review it this afternoon. One more thing, she added. The prosecutor in Blake's case reached out. They're building their case and would like your testimony regarding certain financial transactions you observed. I'll cooperate fully, Doug assured her. Whatever helps ensure he's held accountable. After hanging up, Doug made a decision about the brownstone. Rather than selling it or continuing to lease it, he would donate it to his new foundation as a transitional housing facility for individuals completing trade education programs and entering the workforce. The symbolism wasn't lost on him, transforming the space that had represented his failed marriage into something that would provide genuine opportunity to others. It felt like the appropriate final chapter in his story with Natalie, redirecting the pain of that relationship towards something constructive. That evening, Doug visited one of his original apartment buildings in Dorchester, the property where he'd first met Natalie 11 years earlier. He still maintained ownership, keeping rents affordable despite the neighborhood's gentrification. Several of the original tenants remained, including Mrs. Hernandez, who'd lived in Unit 3B for all 11 years. Mr. Mercer, she greeted him warmly when he stopped by to check on recent maintenance work. You're a sight for sore eyes. We miss seeing you around here. Just checking that everything's working properly, Doug explained. The new heating system was installed last week. Works perfectly, Mrs. Hernandez confirmed. You know, you're the only landlord I've ever had who improves things before they break. Most wait until we're freezing to fix a furnace. The simple observation captured what Doug had always tried to achieve in his business, creating spaces where people could live with dignity, not just collecting rent checks from desperate tenants with no alternatives. I have something for you, Mrs. Hernandez continued, disappearing briefly into her apartment before returning with a newspaper clipping. Thought you might want to see this, though maybe you already have. The clipping was from the Boston Globe's Society page, a photo of Natalie at a Chicago charity event, accompanied by a distinguished-looking older man identified as Dr. Thomas Reed, chief of surgery at Chicago Memorial. Seems she's found someone more her style, Mrs. Hernandez observed with the directness of long acquaintance. Though if you ask me, she traded down. Money and position don't make the man. Doug studied the photo briefly before handing it back. Natalie looked happy, or at least she was presenting the appearance of happiness effectively. He found himself hoping it was genuine, not out of lingering affection, but from the recognition that perpetual status-seeking was its own form of prison. Thanks for showing me, he said simply. But that chapter's closed now. As Doug left the building, his phone buzzed with a text from Rose Flanagan. Blake's extradition approved. Will arrive in Boston next week to face charges. A tempting plea deal, but prosecutors holding firm on minimum 15-year sentence recommendation. Thought you should know. Doug sent a brief acknowledgement, filing the information away without the surge of vindictive pleasure he might have felt months earlier. Blake would face justice through proper legal channels, a more fitting conclusion than the personal destruction Doug had initially sought. Driving back to his apartment, Doug reflected on the journey from that explosive anniversary party to his current state of mind. The revelation of Natalie's affair with Blake had shattered his life, yet from those fragments, he was constructing something new, something perhaps more authentic than what had existed before. The revenge he'd pursued so methodically had ultimately taught him more about himself than about his adversaries. He'd discovered both a capacity for calculated ruthlessness he hadn't previously acknowledged, and, eventually, the wisdom to recognize when vengeance needed to give way to reconstruction. As he parked outside his building, Doug noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. Clarissa Whitfield, elegant, as always in a tailored coat against the autumn chill. "Ms. Whitfield," he greeted her with cautious courtesy as he approached. "This is unexpected. I won't take much of your time," she assured him. "I wanted to thank you personally for modifying the Brunswick Academy arrangement to allow my children to remain. It was more generous than I had any right to expect, given our history." Doug nodded in acknowledgement. "They shouldn't pay for their father's actions, or for my reaction to those actions." "You've changed since our confrontation at the board meeting," Clarissa observed. "Found some perspective, perhaps?" "Something like that," Doug agreed. "And you?" "I understand Blake's legal troubles have implications for your financial interests in his firm." Clarissa smiled thinly. "I diversified my holdings months ago, after our first conversation about Blake's business practices. Call it insurance against exactly what transpired. I'll weather the storm." Her calculated foresight didn't surprise Doug. Clarissa had always demonstrated a pragmatic intelligence in protecting her interests and those of her children. "I also came to deliver this," she continued, handing him an envelope. "It's an invitation to Brunswick Academy's foundation celebration next month. The board felt your endowment contribution warranted recognition, despite the complicated circumstances of its creation." Doug accepted the envelope, appreciating the symbolic olive branch it represented. "I'll consider attending." As Clarissa turned to leave, she offered a parting observation. "You know, Mr. Mercer, revenge is satisfying in the moment, but rarely in retrospect. Building something new, that provides more lasting satisfaction." "Speaking from experience?" Doug inquired. "Let's say I had my own journey after Blake's betrayal," she replied with a knowing smile. "Mine just happened before yours, and with less public drama." After Clarissa departed, Doug entered his apartment and placed the invitation on his desk, alongside blueprints for his next development project and draft documents for the foundation he was establishing. The contrast wasn't lost on him. Plans for construction now occupying the space where evidence of Natalie and Blake's betrayal had once been spread. Where he had once plotted revenge, he now designed future buildings. Where he had once documented deception, he now created opportunity. His phone rang once more, a construction foreman from the South Boston project with a question about materials for the community center. As Doug provided guidance, clarifying his vision for the space, he realized he had found his way back to his original purpose, building things of lasting value. The revenge that had consumed him had served its purpose, clearing away the falsity and pretense that had surrounded his marriage. From that cleared ground, he was constructing something more authentic, both in his business and in himself. When Blake Whitfield arrived in Boston the following week to face justice, Doug watched the news coverage with detachment. The once polished investment manager appeared haggard and diminished as federal agents escorted him from a government vehicle into the courthouse. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, his former confidence replaced by the wary caution of a man facing significant consequences. The sight didn't bring Doug the visceral satisfaction he'd once anticipated. Instead, he felt a sober acknowledgement that justice followed its own course, sometimes through his actions, sometimes despite them, but ultimately separate from his personal vendetta. That same day, Doug finalized the charter for the Mercer Foundation for Housing and Trade Education, signing the documents that would commit significant portions of his wealth to creating opportunities for others to build their own success. As he set down his pen after the final signature, Doug reflected on the words his father had often repeated during those early renovation projects. Words that had temporarily lost meaning during his years with Natalie, but had now returned with renewed clarity. What matters isn't what you own, but what you build that lasts after you're gone. The revenge Doug had sought and ultimately achieved against Blake and Natalie had been complete, professionally, socially, and legally devastating for both. Yet the true victory hadn't come from their downfall, but from his own rebuilding. In that reconstruction, Doug had rediscovered the builder he had always been, not just of properties, but of something more fundamental, a life of purpose and integrity that could withstand betrayal, and emerge stronger from its aftermath.